All right, would someone please read for us from the book of Malachi, chapter 3 and verse 6. So I, the Lord, do not change, therefore you, Jacob, are not consumed. Okay, the Israelites, more than any other group of people, needed the assurance that comes from knowing that God does not change. Many years before, God had promised to bless them as a nation, and he made the promise through their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The promise consisted in being settled in the land of Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey. It also consisted in being favored with the knowledge of God and all the blessings that flowed out of that. But the nation, long after they had settled in the land, sinned. Okay? God did fulfill his promise. He settled them in the land, and they sinned. They sinned grievously against the Lord. And God decided to move them out of the land and to take them into captivity in Babylon. And they stayed in captivity for 70 years, as you know. When Malachi ministered, they have just returned to their own land. They had reformed somewhat because of the sieving and filtering effect of the captivity. So they had become better somewhat. For a moment, they served the Lord. But now they are slipping up again and becoming insensitive to the love of God. And Malachi was the means in God's hand of rebuking them for this. His message was that God would be justified if he decided to destroy them. But in fact, he will not destroy them because he does not change. All right? He is the same God. He may have chastised them, and the intention is to make them better. He may have punished them, but in fact, he will not destroy them because he did not promise to destroy them. And we too, like the Israelites, need this assurance. But we can't come to a complete understanding and appreciation of that without understanding God's unchangeability, or if you like, his immutability. And this is, of course, why I have drawn your attention to Malachi 3 and verse 6. There are three things we must reflect on in regard to this. And the first is that God does not change his being. Okay? God does not change his being. When Malachi says, I do not change, I am the Lord, I do not change, the meaning is that, first of all, he does not change his being. Now, unlike us, who change inwardly and outwardly, such that one moment we may be feeling quite young and well, the next quite old and sick, God is always the same. What he was yesterday, he is today and will be tomorrow and forever, in terms of the quality as well as the quantity of his attributes. To use the language of Hebrews 13 and verse 18, and it is in reference to Christ, he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. It doesn't change. That is the first point. Secondly, when he says, I, the Lord, do not change, he means also that he doesn't change his plan. Doesn't change his plan. Unlike us, who may plan, but because we can't foresee certain circumstances, we are compelled to change our plan in order to accommodate those circumstances. Well, God cannot change, and God does not change. I want us to read two important passages as we continue to reflect on this. Someone can read for us Isaiah chapter 46 and verse 10, and then a little later on I'm going to ask another to read 2 Kings chapter 20 and verse 1. Okay, so he says, "My counsel will stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose." Okay, my counsel will stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. Some versions would say, "My counsel or plan shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." So here, the point being emphasized is that God has a carefully thought out plan from beginning to end. And there are no unforeseen circumstances that would torpedo that plan. He himself says, "My counsel or my plan shall stand." And why will his plan stand? Why will it not change? Well, because God foreknows all things. He doesn't just foreknow all things. When he has planned on the basis of that foreknowledge, he has the power within himself to ensure that all he has planned comes to pass. Okay? So he foreknows. This is what he is going to do, and he knows what he is going to do ahead of time. Okay? It's a bit like an architect. An architect plans what the building will look like. And he knows exactly what it's going to look like because he's the one who planned it. Okay? This foreknowledge of God is not a bare prescience where he just knows about something ahead of time, but he has no control over it. He knows about it ahead of time because he's the one who planned it. And he himself will see to it that the plan comes to pass. So all that he has planned, he says, will stand. It will stand. Now, this raises a very interesting question. If God can't change his being, he can't change in his being, and he can't change in his plans, how come there are passages of Scripture that suggest that he changed? Now, here is one case in point. 2 Kings chapter 20. It seems like the plan of God that Hezekiah would die did not come to pass. Remember, Hezekiah fell sick. And the prophet Isaiah told him that he was going to die. So Hezekiah decided to pray, and he pleaded with God. And God heard his prayer. And a message was sent to Isaiah to tell him to go back to King Hezekiah and tell him that God has heard his prayer, and that in fact he has decided to add 15 more years to his life. Okay? He's decided to add 15 more years to his life. So did God change? In one breath, he is saying, you will die. That's what he's saying in one breath. But in another breath, he is saying, I will add 15 more years to your life. I had said someone is going to read that, but I've told you what it's about. How would you explain that? The Bible everywhere teaches that God cannot change. But here he is. He has promised that he will die. He's told him he will die. One moment later, you will not die. 15 more years will be added to your life. Doesn't that represent a change in God? We understand, according to Isaiah 46 and verse 10, God has a plan, isn't it? Do you think it encompasses everything from beginning to end? Do you think so? Okay? So it encompasses everything from beginning to end. Now, if that is the case, how do we respond to those who can see the beginning, but they can't see the end? Because they believe in a kind of open theism, okay? The plan of God can be shaped by the flow of providence, okay? If people pray hard, they can shape that end to look what they are praying about, so that God is responding to what is going on, in the flow of providence. So we can't be too sure what the end will be. But that, of course, goes contrary to what Isaiah 46 is saying. He has a plan, and that plan will stand. Now, let's see how that applies itself to Hezekiah's situation. Was it God's plan that Hezekiah is going to live for 15 more years? It was his plan. Was it God's plan that 15 years before that time, he would fall sick, it would be announced to him that he would die, he would pray, and then God will answer his prayer by adding that 15 more years? You think that was his plan? Yeah. So we can put it this way, and I think I used this description yesterday. I borrowed it from G.T. Shedd, theologian, 19th century. God can will a change, but he cannot change his will. Want me to say it again? God can will a change. So Isaiah will be born at this moment. He will become a king. He's going to fall sick. Isaiah will tell him that he will die. He will pray, and I will hear his prayer, and Isaiah will go and announce to him that he won't die. 15 more years has been added to his life. So from Hezekiah's perspective, he was sick, he prayed, God heard his prayer and answered his prayer. And so from Isaiah's perspective, Hezekiah's perspective, it's like God has changed. Okay, he was about to die and he prayed. God heard the prayer and gave him another 15 years. That's what it looks like from Isaiah's perspective. But from God's perspective, it was planned to be that way. Do you see the point? It was planned to be that way. And he will pray, and God will hear his prayer and decide to add 15 more years to his life. So in God's scheme of things, he plans and he takes care of all the secondary causes that will act out that plan. So the general plan is from beginning to end. And within the plan, there are various secondary causes, okay, that will act. Hezekiah will fall sick. Isaiah will come. You tell him this, and then Hezekiah's responsibility will be to pray. So as a secondary cause there, he's going to pray. And when he prays, he means what he prays. He's not being engineered from somewhere to pray as he prays. He really wants to pray for a recovery. And he prays, and God hears that prayer and answers it and adds 15 more years to his life. So God has planned it in such a way that history will flow. It's not like he's engineering things. He has also ordained the secondary causes who will act out that flow of history and will be responsible for the decisions they make, the actions they take. If you look at the betrayal and death of Christ, look at Luke chapter 22, verse 22. Who betrayed Christ? It was Judas Iscariot. Did Judas Iscariot want to betray Christ? He did it. He did want to betray Christ. And he did want the 30 pieces of silver, and he was willing to sell his master for 30 pieces of silver. And he did betray Christ. But Luke 22, verse 22 tells us that that is what had been planned from the beginning. Have you noted that? This is exactly what God had planned would happen. Now, if that is what God had planned would happen, would we say that Judas was not responsible for the choice he made because it was planned like that? We can't say that. God planned that, his ultimate plan is that Jesus would die to bring about the salvation of men. Jesus would die in that way. That was God's plan. And Judas is going to act as a secondary cause. The Roman soldiers will act as a secondary cause. They will want to arrest Christ. Judas will want to betray Christ. And they will all want to do that. They will all make those choices, and they will be responsible for those choices. Do you get the point? So God willed all that. Willing those changes doesn't mean he is changing his mind. He would be changing his mind if he didn't foresee that these things would happen. And suddenly he decides, oh, sorry, I didn't foresee that. So we have to change the plan. Because we didn't foresee, we didn't foresee a war in Ukraine. We didn't foresee the fact that the prices of fuel will skyrocket because of a war. So we were hoping for 8% domestic growth in the economy. Well, now we have to revise it downwards. That's normal for humans because we don't foresee all the circumstances. But God can't be caught off guard in that way because he plans everything. And Hezekiah's experience should be interpreted in that way. Okay, let's go on as we think about the immutability of God. We've seen that he doesn't change his being. He doesn't change his plan. In Genesis 1, verse 26, when God says, "Let us make man in our image," and the man he makes is not just a soul, but a body as well. Now, does the image of God include a body? Whose body? Christ. So although he was not yet there in his incarnate form, he was there in the plan of God. And the plan was for men to be made in the image of Christ. Christ who would be there. Well, eventually he did come. If man had not sinned and had continued to obey, he would still have been aiming to become like Christ. Okay? You need to think of it in terms of degrees of glory. We are currently being sanctified from one degree of glory to the next. Well, when we have attained the level that God has prescribed, that work of sanctification in us will have been perfected. But suppose man had not sinned. It would not have been about degrees of sanctification. It would have been about degrees of perfection. Okay, so here is man. He is made at this level of perfection. But through his own obedience, he was supposed to advance to another level of perfection. Okay? So what would have been the criteria for determining that other level of perfection? Well, Christ. Do you see the point? Christ. We are now speculating a little bit. Would he have still come into the world? Would he have come on a different mission? Well, we don't know. But in the mind of God, Christ is there, the ideal humanity that men must aspire to become. And all of that was comprehended in the plan of God. The change was accounted for in the plan of God. Well, God is the one who can't change. But he can decree change in man. For example, we change. As we are growing older, all of that is change. The universe changes, and so many other things change. He doesn't. Even his will does not change. He can will a change, but he cannot change his will. You get the logic, right? Okay, shall we go on to promises? God does not change his promises. Numbers 23 verse 19. I think someone had read that verse for us. Was that yesterday? So first, we are told that God is not a man that he should change. So men change, but God is not a man. So he does not change. In that same vein, God is not going to change his promises. If he has made a promise, he will bring it to pass. Okay? In other words, he will fulfill his promises. When God promises anything, He will bring it to pass. God promised the children of Israel blessing. Okay? He promised them land, He gave them land. Promised them ongoing blessing if they remain faithful to Him. To the extent that they remained faithful, He blessed them. But to the extent that they failed to remain faithful, He didn't bless them. When they sinned against Him and proved unfaithful to God, He cursed them. In the same way, when God promises salvation to believers, He will see to it that they get salvation. In Romans 10:13, we read, "Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." And when you are saved, your assurance of salvation will not depend on how you feel, but on what God has said. Okay? God has said, if you believe, you will be saved. When you believe, it is God's duty. He holds Himself to His promise to fulfill it, and He does. Nothing will stand in the way of that fulfillment. So, if we know He has promised, we have to stand on that promise. And God will make it good. God will make it happen. All right, let's come to some applications. What practical applications can you draw from this doctrine of the immutability of God or the unchangeability of God? Like we have noticed with other of God's attributes, even the immutability of God must inspire worship and adoration. None but God is unchangeable. I mean, that must surprise us. We are so used to seeing change. We see change in ourselves. We see change in the world. We see change all over. We see change in seasons. We are accustomed to seeing change on a daily basis. But here is a being who cannot change. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That must cause us to marvel. That must cause us to marvel. Secondly, the fact that God is unchangeable establishes the ground of our assurance. The fact that God is unchangeable establishes the ground of our assurance. Think for a moment, if God was changeable, one moment He would be a good God. The next moment He would be a bad God. We would have no guarantee rather that if He is being good to us today, He will continue to be good to us tomorrow. Furthermore, if He loved us today, we would have no guarantee that He would continue to love us tomorrow. But we know that what He is today, He will be tomorrow. He's unchangeable. And that gives us certainty. That gives us the sense of assurance we need. We don't need a temperamental God. We need a God who is stable, so to say. And that is what He is. That Jesus is God must point to the fact that He Himself does not change. If He was just a man, He would change. Okay? He did change. Even just growing from a baby to an adult was change. From life to death was change. But he is God. He is God. So all he has achieved for us will remain forever. And we will all obtain the promises he made to us. So that is an important point for us to make. Well, we can only depend on what he has written himself. Okay, if he has told us that if you believe in Christ, you'll be saved. That's what he has told us. Now, can he change that? He hasn't told us. We believe in what is written. We believe in what he has promised. We can't bank on what he has not revealed. What he has revealed is that he will fulfill his promise. So we believe in that. Is there some secret plan for him not to fulfill his promise? Well, that will reveal inconsistency in himself, which he can't be. So it is unlikely that that will be the case. It's actually impossible that that will be the case. Well, first, the Bible itself tells us that he will keep his promise. You know, we're just reading from Numbers 23. Take the promise for people to be saved when they believe in Christ. They do get saved when they believe in Christ. There has never been an instance where someone believes in Christ and they are not saved. That would be a case of God breaking his promise. It's never happened. So we must believe his word. We must believe the promises. Unless there was a promise which says you can actually believe and not get saved, then there will be a contradiction in the counsel of God. On the one hand, he tells us, if you believe, you'll be saved. But on the other hand, he tells us, if you believe, you won't be saved. That would be a contradiction in the promise, in the counsel of God. And it's impossible for there to be a contradiction. And the point he makes is very important there. You know, sometimes we can make a big doctrine out of an incident which was not meant to make any big doctrine out of it. Like, you know, Samuel was made to come back from the dead with the help of a witch. So should we conclude that we cannot go to witches when our relatives can go to witches when we die and we'll come back to life? Yeah, we need to be careful about things like that. But in a doctrine like this, there is so much other witness, okay, supporting verses and doctrines. So we have comfort that we are on solid ground when we hold to this doctrine, yes. So we'll now move on to the infinitude of God. The infinitude of God. I'll try and make it easy, okay? The infinitude of God. Would someone volunteer to read from Isaiah 55, verse 8 through to 9? And then 9, for as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Now, this is a mysterious subject, the infinitude of God. And it is mysterious because it seeks to capture an aspect of God that for us, limited beings, that we are, is utterly unimaginable and incomprehensible. Isaiah, whose mission it was to draw the people of Israel back to their God, attempts to capture something of the infinitude of God, particularly in the area of forgiveness. He says, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are God's ways higher than our ways. Okay? As the heavens are higher than our ways, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are God's ways higher than our ways. But how are we to understand the infinitude of God? And I'll give us a definition. The infinitude of God is that perfection of God whereby He is lifted above the limitations to which His creatures are subject. It is that perfection of God or attribute of God whereby He is lifted above the perfection, above the limitations to which His creatures are subject. So I was just defining the infinitude of God, and I was saying that it is that perfection of God whereby He is lifted above the limitations to which His creatures are subject. His creatures, like us, are subject to all manner of limitations. God is lifted above all of those limitations. For that reason, some people have also said, to say that God is infinite is to say that He is illimitable. Okay? He is illimitable. He cannot be limited by anything. The things that limit His creatures cannot limit Him. So we are going to look at this infinitude once again in various areas. First, we'll look at His infinitude as it relates to His being. Secondly, as it relates to space. And thirdly, as it relates to time. Okay. So let's begin with His infinitude as it relates to His being. Herman Bavinck refers to this illimitation as God's perfection, His absolute perfection. Okay? God is absolutely perfect. Take the knowledge of God, which is an expression of His being. It's infinite. And we are going to look in another lecture about that. It's infinite. In other words, there are no limits to what God knows. His wisdom is infinite. There are no limits to His wisdom. His holiness is infinite. There are no limits to His holiness. Everything that God is has this infinite quality. So it is absolutely perfect. In the matter of showing forgiveness, for instance, unlike man, nothing can limit God's ability to forgive. Do you see the point? Our ability to forgive may be limited, but nothing can limit God's ability to forgive. And that is the point being made there. We won't take too much time there. I want us to move on. And let's look at His infinitude with respect to time. Do you know another name for that attribute which describes His infinitude with respect to time? That's right. That is His eternality or His eternity. Psalm 90 and verse 2, we are told God is from everlasting to everlasting. Okay? Is from everlasting to everlasting. That is another way of saying God is eternal. From everlasting. It's like if you look behind, what you are seeing is, if you're asking the question, so where did God start from? Well, you can't see anything. All you see is a vanishing point. If you look ahead and you ask the question, where will God end? Again, you only see a vanishing point. It's like there is no beginning, there is no end. So eternity consists of these three qualities. First, if God is eternal, the meaning is that he has no beginning. Okay? He is everlasting. Creatures have a beginning. Creatures are therefore subject to time. When God created everything, he subjected everything to time. Okay? Subjected everything to time. God has no beginning, so he is not subject to time. He is from everlasting. He is from a duration stretching backwards without limit. From everlasting. No beginning. The second thing about eternity is that he has no end. No beginning, no end. He's from everlasting to everlasting. His duration stretches forward without limit. As creatures, we have an end. He doesn't. Another characteristic of eternity is that, maybe let me put this as a question to you. If he has no beginning and he has no end, well, what about in between the beginning and the end? How do we describe that in terms of his eternity? Ever present. Okay? Perhaps we can say he lives in one eternal present. He has no succession of moments. You live minute by minute, hour by hour, okay, second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, okay? You have succession of moments. Well, God has no succession of moments. He lives in one unending present, okay? One eternal present. It's another way of saying he lives forever. That's the point. Now, the Apostle Peter, let's look at 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8. Peter says, with God, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. So he's trying to capture this eternal present, okay? He's trying to use our limitedness to describe something illimitable. I think this is why he uses language such as his ways are higher than our ways. You know, the difference between God's ways and our ways is the difference of an infinity. Okay? You can't measure it. It is immeasurable. So that is like a weak or limited way of trying to capture the idea of eternity. Okay? I think Peter is doing the same thing here. 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. So this is like a limited way of trying to capture the idea of eternity. So what this implies is that for God, there never was a yesterday, and there never will be a tomorrow. There are no successions of moments. There is, however, an ongoing day. An ongoing day. And to use the language of Peter, the day is as long as 1,000 years. That's just a human way of trying to say an ongoing day. This, of course, is the reason why God refers to himself as the I am. We already looked at that point earlier on. So God is not limited by time. We can define eternality as that perfection of God whereby he is lifted above the limitation of time. Okay? Infinitude, that attribute of God or perfection of God, whereby he is lifted above the limitations to which his creatures are subject. We narrow that down to time. He is lifted above the limitations of time. Okay? Is that clear to everyone? Any questions? Okay, let's come to his infinitude with respect to space. What do you think another name for that could be? Yes. Presence. His omnipresence, yes. His omnipresence. Anyone else? Is there any other way of putting it? Okay, let's look at that and we'll see whether there is anything more. When we say that God is not limited by space, we are describing that infinitude whereby he is lifted above the limitations of space. He is lifted above the limitations of space. So what that means is, number one, that he cannot be contained by space. He cannot be contained by space. Would someone read for us from 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 27? Part of Solomon's prayer when he was dedicating the temple. So what is he saying about the house that he had built? It cannot contain him. The heavens can't contain you. So the house that I have built cannot contain you. He cannot be contained by space. He can't be hemmed in so that he's closed up in some space. He transcends space. Okay? He goes beyond spatial boundaries. He goes beyond spatial boundaries. And Solomon there is testifying to the fact that God cannot be contained in any space, unlike idols that can be contained not just by space, but a very small space. God cannot be contained by any space. He transcends it. The second thing we notice about God is that he cannot be absent from any space. He can't be contained by any space. So that speaks of his transcendence. Okay, he transcends spatial limitations. But the fact that he transcends spatial limitations doesn't mean he is absent from space. He cannot be absent from any space. Going back to Psalm 139 once again, where David makes this very clear. Who can flee from your spirit, and where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall fall on me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day. Darkness and the light are both alike to you. So he is present in space. That is called his immanence. Okay, his immanence. He transcends space. He's present in space. Transcends. He is immanent. He is present. Now, sometimes the omnipresence of God is distinguished from his immanence. And the difference, some theologians would say, is that his omnipresence refers to his presence to the created universe. And his immanence refers to his presence everywhere. And there are places, there is space, that is not populated by humans or developed. Is God in that space as well? The answer is yes. And immanence would tend to emphasize that. Omnipresence would then tend to emphasize his presence to the created universe, his presence to man, to you. He's present wherever you are. So that is a detail that sometimes theologians go into. So we can see that God is not limited within himself. He cannot be limited by time, and he cannot be limited by space. Yeah, I was quoting some theologians who would say omnipresence is about his presence to his created universe, to man, to other created things. But space goes beyond what we may term as the developed universe, okay? And there are places that are said to be just holes, okay? Empty space. Now, empty space in itself is a creation. God created and put things in space. So space itself is a creation. But there are places, that is what this idea is suggesting, there are places that are not filled. There is space, but it's like it's unfilled. It's just space. And from where we stand, it looks like it's just darkness, nothing else. And immanence would then tend to stress not just the fact that he is present with us, but present everywhere. And omnipresence is limited to his created universe. Yeah. That's just a theological gymnastic. All right. Yeah, that's a good question. We can include, along with that question, a question like, what is the difference between the way he is present in hell and the way he is present in heaven? The way he is present with his worshiping people who are gathered in his name, and the way he is present elsewhere. And sometimes theologians draw a distinction between God's essential presence and God's manifested presence. And his essential presence relates to the fact that his being, by its very nature, demands that he be present everywhere, wherever there is space. Never mind whether that space is hell or heaven or among his gathered people, he is there everywhere. His manifested presence, however, stresses the fact that the way he manifests that essential presence is different from situation to situation, place to place. In hell, for example, he manifests his justice. Okay? People are there, they are suffering because of sin, and God is there to mete out that punishment. So he is present to manifest his wrath to a people that deserve to experience that wrath. On the other hand, he is present in heaven to manifest his grace. Okay? He can't manifest his grace in hell. He manifests it in heaven. So both are experiencing the presence of God, but rather differently. The way he is present among his gathered people, is the assembly of God's people, is different from the way he is present among a people who are actually dishonoring his name. They could be gathered in a bar, drinking their heads off. He is present among the people here to reveal his glory, those who are praying to him, to bless them. He is not present to do that in this other situation. So the difference between the essential presence and the manifested presence. Does that help? All right. Can you think of some practical implications arising from the infinitude of God? The infinitude respecting space includes omnipresence. That's what we've been saying.
And this is also within that?
Yeah. So there are two things there. On the one hand, he transcends space.
Yeah.
He can't be contained by space. But on the other, he is present in space. Yeah, not absent from it. The fact that he transcends space doesn't mean he is absent from it.
Yeah.
And it is when you deal with that presence in space that you discuss omnipresence stroke immanence. Yeah. Yeah. Omnipresence is on the same level as immanence. It's just a little emphasis in terms of presence with his created universe. It encourages, it inspires the fear of the Lord, we put it that way. Okay, so the first thing we saw was that God is not limited in his being. He's absolutely perfect. Now, what does Matthew 5, verse 48 say about what we should be aspiring to? To be perfect, just like God is perfect. Okay? He's absolutely perfect. So he is the ideal. So as we strive to better ourselves, God must be our standard. And we must work hard to be as he is as much as possible. We won't ever become as he is, but that must be our goal, to be as perfect as he is. And then the second thing is that God is eternal, must not only fill our minds with wonder and adoration as to how this can be, it must also fill our hearts with encouragement that the God with whom we have to do can never cease. Now, this is the point of Psalm 90, yeah? How many days has God ordained for man? 70, if you have strength, 80. So you live to be 70, if you have strength, 80. So people will die. Some will die much earlier than that. But if God is gracious upon them, they will live to be 80 or even more. But God will not die. He is from everlasting to everlasting. Do you see that? So that is intended to give us hope, to give us comfort. He will be our stay. You are saying, look, my father may die, so will my mother. But my children may go before I. And that will be painful. But God will never die. God will never die. My comforter will never die. My encourager will always be. Another matter we must reflect upon is the fact that God has placed eternity in our hearts. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 11 says God has put eternity in our hearts. Now, because we have eternity, this sense of unendingness within us, we have our souls, we do have a desire to live forever. Anybody here who has no desire to live forever? We have a desire to live forever. We want to live well, we want to have medical care so we can live on and on. That desire to live forever is by virtue of what God has put within us. Okay? It's by virtue of what God has put within us. And what will satisfy this eternity that God has put within us are not things that are temporary. They are things that are eternal. So if you are sowing to the temporary, you are thinking about life only in terms of this world, you will never be happy, you will never be fulfilled. But if you are sowing to the Spirit, sowing to eternity, you will be satisfied. That is where your happiness comes from. It's not the things of this world that makes you happy. They are there for you to enjoy, most certainly, but they never satisfy the deeper needs of the soul. Only God can do that. You are with me. And then the doctrine of the infinity of God is overwhelming. It does indeed overwhelm us. It is overwhelming enough that God is infinite. Now, to think that God, who is unlimited in his being, can become a limited man. I'm now talking about the incarnation of Christ. That the unlimited God can become a limited man, subject to time and space, should be even more overwhelming. But that in itself is intended to bridge the gap, okay, between the limited and the illimitable. Now, it brings us to a point you were raising earlier on, okay? God is high up there, and we are down here. He is unlimited. We are limited. So what is it that can bridge the gap between us? Christ. He is both God, unlimited, and man, limited. So he can represent God with man. In that sense, he is a prophet. He can represent man with God. In that sense, he is a priest. So the gap is filled in that way. It's a beautiful point to end this session.